It's May of 1990. In a control room in Maryland, a group of astronomers crowd around a monitor, waiting for the most anticipated photograph in the history of science. Above them, 350 miles up, floats a telescope the size of a school bus. It cost $1.5 billion. It took more than a decade to build. It was sold to the world as the machine that would finally let humanity see to the edge of the universe. The first image appears on the screen. And it's wrong. A bright star that should be a sharp, clean point of light is a fuzzy, swollen smear. The engineers assume it's a focusing problem. They send commands to adjust. Nothing helps. They try again. Still a blur. Over the next few weeks, a terrible suspicion hardens into fact. The problem isn't the focus. The problem is the mirror, the single most important part of the entire telescope, polished more carefully than any mirror ever made. Something about it is fundamentally, permanently wrong. The most expensive science instrument ever launched into space could not see straight. The question everyone would spend the next 3 years trying to answer was simple. How does $1.5 billion telescope go blind? The answer began 20 years earlier with a dream. To understand the disaster, you have to understand the dream. For all of human history, we looked at the stars through an ocean of moving air. Every telescope on Earth, no matter how big or how perfect, sits at the bottom of the atmosphere. And the atmosphere never holds still. It shimmers and ripples like heat above a road. That's why stars twinkle. It's beautiful to look at, and it's a catastrophe for astronomy, because it smears every distant object into a trembling blur. In 1946, 12 years before NASA even existed, a young astrophysicist named Lyman Spitzer wrote a paper proposing the obvious, impossible solution. Put the telescope above the air, lift it clear of the atmosphere entirely, into the perfect stillness of space, and it could see with a clarity no ground telescope could ever match, not a little better, roughly 10 times sharper. Looking back across billions of years toward the moment galaxies first switched on, for decades it stayed a fantasy. Nobody could lift a mirror that heavy into orbit, or aim it with the precision required, holding steady on a target the width of a coin seen from miles away. But Spitzer spent the next 50 years of his life pushing for it. And slowly, the impossible telescope started to look like something a country might actually try to build. Building it was a war fought in committee rooms. In the 1970s, NASA brought the idea to Congress, and Congress balked at the price. The first proposal was rejected outright. Lawmakers couldn't see why the country should spend a fortune on a telescope when there were budgets to cut and a public that mostly shrugged at astronomy. So the astronomers did something scientists almost never do. They organized. They formed a lobbying campaign, wrote thousands of letters, and personally visited the offices of members of Congress to explain, face to face, what a telescope above the atmosphere could actually show. If you're finding this story interesting, take a second to subscribe. We dig into the real history behind builds like this one all the time. To survive the budget knife, the project had to shrink. The planned mirror was cut down from 3 meters to 2.4. Costs were shared with the European Space Agency. Even then it barely passed. Finally, at the end of the 1970s, the telescope was approved, and the contract to build its heart, the primary mirror, went to an optics company in Connecticut called Perkin-Elmer, a firm with a reputation for building the finest precision optics on Earth, much of it for classified spy satellites. They were the experts. They were the best in the world at exactly this, and that reputation was about to make everything that followed so much harder to catch. The telescope mirror has to be shaped to an almost unimaginable precision. Hubble's primary mirror was 8 feet across, and its surface had to be ground into a perfect curve, accurate to a fraction of the wavelength of light. If you scaled that mirror up to the width of the Atlantic Ocean, the tallest allowed bump on its surface would be a few inches. Perkin-Elmer's engineers polished it for months, and by one measure they succeeded brilliantly. The mirror they produced was the smoothest large mirror ever made by human hands. But smooth and correct are not the same thing. To check the shape, they built a special measuring device called a null corrector, essentially a precise optical ruler that tells you whether the curve is right. And when they assembled it, a single small lens was held in place at the wrong distance, off by about a millimeter. That millimeter told the polishing machine to grind the mirror to the wrong curve, flawlessly. There were warning signs. 2 other simpler test instruments disagreed with the main one, hinting that something was off. But the main device was the high-tech one, the one the team trusted, so the conflicting results were set aside as errors in the cheaper tools. Nobody ran the one independent test that would have caught it. The mirror was declared perfect. It was sealed, crated, and built into a telescope. The most precisely wrong object ever manufactured was now bolted into the heart of a billion-dollar machine, and no one on Earth knew. Getting it off the ground was its own ordeal. Hubble was designed to ride to orbit inside the space shuttle, and in January of 1986, the shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 astronauts aboard. The entire shuttle fleet was grounded for nearly 3 years. Hubble, already finished, sat in a specially built clean room, waiting. Keeping it pristine cost millions of dollars every single month. Engineers nicknamed the wait the most expensive storage bill in history. Finally, on April 24, 1990, the shuttle Discovery rose off the pad at Cape Canaveral with the telescope tucked in its cargo bay. The next day, the crew lifted Hubble out on the robotic arm and let it go. Its solar panels unfurled. It caught the sunlight and began to drift free, 350 miles above the planet, the most powerful telescope humanity had ever placed in space. On the ground, the people who had spent 20 years of their lives on this machine allowed themselves to celebrate. After the budget fights, after the delays, after the disaster, it was finally where it belonged. All that was left was to open its eye and take the first picture. They had no idea what was coming. It's 3 weeks after launch. The team gathers for first light the moment the telescope opens its aperture and takes its first real image. A star appears on the screen, and it's surrounded by a soft, glowing halo, like a streetlight seen through fog. The engineers stay calm. New telescopes always need focusing. They send commands to move the mirror, nudging it back and forth, hunting for the sharp point they know is there. It never comes. No matter where they set the focus, the star keeps its ghostly halo. Days pass. The mood in the building curdles from confusion to dread. Specialists are flown in. They run the numbers on the blurred light, working backward from the shape of the smear. And the answer they keep arriving at is the one nobody wants to say out loud. This is not a focus problem. This is not software. The mirror itself, the 8-foot piece of glass at the core of the entire telescope, the part that absolutely could not be wrong, is the wrong shape. And it's in orbit, 350 miles up, where no one can reach it. The dream had launched perfectly, and it could not see. The flaw had a name: spherical aberration. The outer edge of the mirror had been ground too flat, so the light bouncing off the rim focused in a slightly different place than the light from the center. Instead of all meeting at one crisp point, the rays smeared across a tiny region. How far off was the edge? About 2.2 microns. A micron is 1,000th of a millimeter. 2.2 of them is roughly 1/50th the width of a single human hair. That is the entire size of the mistake that humiliated NASA and turned $1.5 billion telescope into a punchline. It sounds impossibly small, but to light, which measures the world in wavelengths far smaller still, it was a canyon. Here, though, is the strange thing. A telescope that's blurry in a random, messy way is hopeless. You can never untangle the chaos. But Hubble's mirror wasn't random. It was wrong in a perfectly smooth, perfectly consistent, perfectly measurable way. The engineers could describe the error with a single clean number. And in optics, an error you can describe exactly is an error you can cancel exactly. If they could build a second optical surface with the precise opposite mistake, the two flaws would erase each other. The telescope wasn't broken beyond repair, it was wearing the wrong prescription, and prescriptions can be corrected if you can get to the patient. While engineers worked the problem, the public reached a simpler verdict. Hubble was a joke. Newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Cartoonists drew the telescope with thick eyeglasses. Late-night hosts built monologues around it. In the comedy film The Naked Gun, the Hubble Space Telescope appeared in a montage of history's great disasters, hung on a wall beside the Hindenburg and the Titanic. For NASA, the timing could not have been worse. This was an agency still rebuilding trust after losing 7 astronauts on Challenger. Now its flagship science mission, sold to taxpayers as a triumph, had become a national embarrassment. $1.5 billion of glass that couldn't take a clear picture. Congress demanded answers. An investigation board was convened, and it laid the failure bare. Not a freak accident, but a quality control breakdown, warning signs ignored, a single instrument trusted too far. It would have been easy, politically, to write Hubble off, to call it a costly lesson and move on. But the people closest to the telescope refused, because they knew something the headlines didn't. The mirror's flaw was understood down to the last decimal place. The telescope wasn't dead, it was correctable. And NASA had one tool nobody else in the world possessed: astronauts, and a shuttle that could fly to it. The fix was, in principle, beautifully simple. Give the telescope glasses. The problem split into two parts. Hubble's main camera could be replaced wholesale. Engineers built a brand new camera with the corrective curve ground directly into its own little mirrors, so the light was fixed the instant it arrived. But the telescope also carried other instruments that couldn't simply be swapped out. For those, the team designed something remarkable, an instrument they called COSTAR. Picture a device the size of a phone booth, packed with 10 small mirrors no bigger than coins, each one mounted on a motorized arm. Once in place, those arms would swing the tiny mirrors directly into the beam of starlight inside the telescope, intercepting it before it reached the older instruments and bending it by exactly the right amount to undo the flaw. Each mirror had to be positioned to within a fraction of the width of a hair. They were, in the most literal sense, a pair of contact lenses built for a telescope, custom ground to a prescription measured from 350 miles away. On paper, it would work. The optics were sound, the math was certain, but there was one enormous catch. None of it could be installed from the ground. To give Hubble its sight back, human beings would have to fly up to it, grab a free-floating telescope out of the vacuum, and rebuild its insides by hand in orbit. What NASA was about to attempt had never been done. The plan called for 5 back-to-back spacewalks on a single mission, at a time when most shuttle flights managed 1 or 2 at most. 7 astronauts would have to perform delicate surgery on a multi-billion-dollar patient, wearing pressurized gloves so stiff that simply closing a fist all day left their hands raw and bleeding. So they trained as no crew had trained before. They spent hundreds of hours underwater, in an enormous pool holding a full-size mock-up of the telescope, where neutral buoyancy mimics the weightlessness of orbit. Every bolt, every handhold, every connector was rehearsed until it became muscle memory. Engineers invented more than 100 custom tools just for this mission. The team practiced for failures too. Jammed latches, stuck doors, bolts that wouldn't turn, drilling the contingencies as hard as the plan itself. The stakes were absolute. Hubble had never been designed to be taken apart in space by human hands under this kind of pressure. A dropped tool, a snagged tether, a connector forced the wrong way. Any of it could turn the most expensive telescope in history into permanent orbiting scrap. There would be no second attempt funded if they failed. In December of 1993, the crew of shuttle mission STS-61 climbed aboard Endeavour, strapped in, and waited for the engines to light. Endeavour reaches the telescope on the 3rd day. The robotic arm stretches out, locks onto Hubble, and pulls it into the cargo bay like a mechanic hoisting an engine onto a stand. Then the spacewalks begin. Day after day, 2 astronauts at a time push out into the vacuum. They work in 90-minute cycles of blazing sunlight and total darkness as the shuttle races around the Earth every hour and a half. Sunrise, sunset, 16 times a day. They install the new camera with its built-in correction. They open the telescope's body and slide COSTAR into place, threading its mirrors into the path of the starlight. Not everything goes smoothly. A pair of doors refuses to latch, and for tense minutes the whole mission hangs on getting them shut, until the crew improvises, working the stubborn panels closed by hand. Over 5 spacewalks, they log more hours outside than any shuttle crew in history. Solar panels swapped, gyroscopes replaced, new electronics fitted, every connector seated by aching gloved hands in the cold and the dark. On the final spacewalk, the last access door is sealed. The astronauts climb back inside. The robotic arm lifts the telescope up out of the bay and releases it, and Hubble drifts free once more, rebuilt, refitted, and carrying brand new eyes. Now everything came down to one picture. Weeks pass while the telescope is checked out and its new instruments warmed up. Then, in the first days of 1994, the team points Hubble at a spiral galaxy called M100 and takes a picture. The data streams down to the ground. The image builds on the screen, line by line, and there is no halo, no fog, no smear. The spiral arms of a galaxy 50 million light-years away snap into focus, sharp and clean. Individual stars resolve like grains of sand. The blur is gone. The control room erupts. People who had spent 3 years living under a national joke, who had been mocked on television and grilled by Congress, stand and cheer and weep. The fix had worked. Every tiny mirror, every gloved adjustment in the dark, every hour underwater had landed exactly where it needed to. NASA called a press conference and put the before and after images side by side, the swollen blur, and beside it the crystalline spiral. The difference was undeniable. The telescope that couldn't see had been given sight, and the instrument the world had written off was, suddenly, everything it was always meant to be. What the saved telescope did next reshaped how we understand the universe. In 1995, astronomers made a daring bet. They aimed Hubble at a patch of sky near the Big Dipper, so small and so empty it looked like nothing at all. A speck you could cover with a grain of sand held at arm's length. And they left the shutter open for 10 straight days. When the light was added up, that empty speck was not empty. It was crowded with around 3,000 galaxies, some of them so distant their light had traveled for more than 10 billion years to reach the lens. In a sliver of blank sky, Hubble had found a forest of entire galaxies. That single image, the Hubble Deep Field, rewrote our sense of scale overnight. Over the decades that followed, the telescope helped pin down the age of the universe at roughly 14 billion years. It gathered the evidence that the universe isn't just expanding but accelerating. Driven by a mysterious dark energy nobody can fully explain. It made more than 1.5 million observations and fed tens of thousands of scientific papers. Astronauts returned to service it 4 more times, keeping it alive far beyond its planned life. The blurry embarrassment of 1990 had become, by almost any measure, the most productive scientific instrument ever built. And it let ordinary people, for the first time, simply look and see the universe in focus. Think about how close it came. A mistake the width of a 50th of a hair made by the best optics company on Earth, missed because the people checking trusted the wrong instrument. A telescope that cost $1.5 billion, launched into orbit blind, mocked on late-night television as one of history's great failures. By every reasonable measure, it should have ended there, a costly lesson, quietly retired. Instead, a small group of people refused to accept that the story was over. They measured the flaw to the last decimal. They built a pair of glasses the size of a phone booth. They sent human beings into the vacuum to rebuild a telescope by hand. And they turned the most famous failure in the history of science into its most celebrated success. The pictures that taught us the age of the universe came from a machine the world had already written off. The greatest eye we ever built on the cosmos was, for a while, completely blind. And saved by people who simply would not let it stay that way. If stories like this one are why you're here, subscribe. There are more impossible builds worth telling.